Welcome to our fourth lesson entitled Tabular and Graphical Presentations. Please take note that this is the last lecture before our first shifting examination and the last topic under your descriptive statistics. The ILOs for this lesson are the following. So at the end of the session, all students should be able to identify and describe the different parts of a table, generate tables appropriate for a given dataset, identify and describe the different parts of graphs, determine the appropriate graphs for presentation of a given dataset, and generate graphs using MS Excel and SAS, and interpret and document results of generated graphs. This topic is relatively easy and short. Our topic outline will just include the different types and parts of a tabular presentation and the different types of your graphical presentations. In research, generally, you have three ways in presenting your data. It could be through the narrative method, your tabular method, or your graphical method. As the term implies, the narrative method of data presentation involves the textual presentation of the data that you collected, processed, and analyzed as a researcher. In contrast with your tabular presentation that uses tables to provide a compact way of presenting large sets of information. If they are made accurately, they can point out trends for comparison and interrelationship among variables that are not readily apparent in narrative listing of data. Note that there are different styles in constructing a table. Journal publications have different rules and formats. But in general, a table must have the following parts. Number 1 is the table number that is placed on the line of its title. All tables should be numbered consecutively as they appear on a report. The next one is the title that will give a complete information as to the what, who, where, and when of the table. It is usually placed before the table. All titles should be self-explanatory and should be able to set the tone of what is expected from the table. It should also give no more or no less what it indicates. So for this example, can we consider this title as a good title? Well, the answer is no, because the title here did not provide the information where the data were collected and when the data were collected. Aside from the title number and the title, we also have your column heading that indicates the basis of the column or the vertical series of the figures, and your row headings, which indicates the basis of the row or the horizontal series in the table. We also have the body of the table and the source of the data if ever the data that are presented in the table came from a previously published research. The following are some pointers about the table presentation. Ideally, a table should be immediately placed after the text where it was first cited. Table should never be placed before the text that mentions it to avoid confusion on the part of the reader. While various journals present different format, it is important to standardize a particular style for a report. Uniformity creates a feeling of normal expectation on the part of the reader. Thus, it is very important that the font style, the font size, and the font color used in the table are consistent from table 1 up to the last table that you will use in your report. Although tables can present large number of information, number of variables presented in a table should be limited to 7 to 10 variables. Lastly, every table should be self-explanatory. The reader should be able to understand the content of the table without referring to the textual explanation. As for the types of tables, basically we have two types that differ from the content and the type of the report where you can find them. The first one is the master table that includes the data collected, processed, and analyzed by the researcher. It is often found at the final manuscript or the thesis defense of a researcher. In contrast with the dummy tables, which do not have any information at all about the data of interest in the study. It is part of the research proposal of the researcher, since this is one of the aspects that a reviewer of a research looks into to be able to make sure that the researcher is aware about the data that he or she will be collecting for the study. Aside from classifying the tables into masters or dummy table, we can also classify them based on the number of variables that they present. If the table only presents one variable, then this is an example of a one-way table. If it presents two variables, basically we call it as a two-way or a contingency table. If on the other hand it presents more than two variables, then we call that table as a multi-way table. Let us now go to the last type of data presentation, which is graphical presentation. Graphs, diagrams, charts, and other pictorial representation of data offer several advantages over that of the data cast in a tabular form. Graphs are simpler to read and appeal to a greater number of people than that of the table. Large, complex masses of data can be presented in a simpler language so that significant trends or patterns which could otherwise be missed in a table can be made to stand out more clearly. The use of colored, imaginative figures, other devices can further emphasize certain aspects of the data. But take note that the real meat of reports, however, lies in the statistical tables. There are no alternative to tables when large set of detailed information is required. However, when precision is not that required, graphs offers a wider point of view of the dataset. In health research, generally, we use the following graphs. We have your bar graph, the pie chart, the component bar graph, the histogram, the frequency polygon, the line diagram, and your scatter plot. Let us first discuss your bar graph. Basically, your bar graph is used to portray absolute or relative frequencies, population rates, or other numerical measurements across the categories of a qualitative variable or a discrete quantitative variable. Bar graphs are especially useful for comparing data between different classifications or categories. In a bar graph, the frequencies or rates are presented by bars or rectangles whose lengths or heights are proportional to their values. Comparisons between categories or groupings are thus made on the basis of the lengths or the heights of these bar graphs. The bars should all be equal width, and gaps should be made to separate them to emphasize discontinuity. A bar graph can be presented horizontally or vertically. Basically, qualitative variables are depicted by your horizontal bar graphs, while discrete quantitative variables are presented using a vertical bar graph. The next type of graph is your pie chart. A pie chart is used to show how a whole is divided into component parts through the use of a wedge-shaped figure. The area of each wedge or slice is proportional to the relative contribution of the component to the whole pie. In public health, we use pie chart in showing the components or parts of qualitative variables or showing the breakdown of funds, budgets, or expenses. Another type of graph is your component bar diagram or your component bar graph. Please take note that it can be used as an alternative to the pie chart because it can also show how a whole is made up of its component. But instead of a wedge-shaped figure, this type of graph uses a bar that represents the whole that is divided into smaller rectangles representing the parts. The area of each smaller rectangle is proportional to the relative contribution of the component to the whole. But take note that your component bar diagram is preferable over the pie chart in comparing the composition of two or more different groups. Like for example, in our hypertension study, take note that the information about the lifestyle of the participants or the number of people who answered yes or no for the different lifestyle questions were presented using a component bar graph. So instead of presenting pie charts for physical activities, for the type of food that they eat, for their alcoholic beverage drinking status and smoking status, the researcher used a component bar graph to present the number of people who answered yes or who answered no in the lifestyle questions. The other type of graph is your histogram. Basically, it's a graphical representation of the frequency distribution of a continuous quantitative variable. A histogram, like a bar graph, has a rectangle or bar that is used to depict the counts or the absolute or relative frequencies of each class or groupings. But please take note that unlike your bar graph, there are no gaps between the bars in your histogram. And this is because, again, your histogram is used to present information about continuous quantitative data, in contrast with the discrete quantitative variables that are presented in a bar graph. Another type of graph is your frequency polygon, which has basically the same function as your histogram. It is used to present information about your continuous variables. Please take note that this frequency polygon is more advantageous compared with your histogram if two or more distributions are needed to be depicted in one graph. So instead of making two or more histograms, you can present the information about two or more distributions using a frequency polygon. The next type of graph is your line graph or your line diagram. This is primarily intended to portray trends or changes in the variable with time. For example, changes in the growth of population, the birth rates and death rates, the morbidity and mortality rates over time are best portrayed using a line graph. Please take note that like your frequency polygon and your component bar graph, you can present two or more sets of observations using your line diagram. The last type of graph is your scatter plot. A scatter plot or a scatter point diagram is used to show the relationship between two quantitative variables. It gives a rough estimation of the type and the degree of correlation, whether it's a direct correlation or an indirect correlation between the variables. This type of graph is usually made as a preliminary steps towards more detailed mathematical correlational analysis. Thus, it is often seen in analytical types of study designs. These are the references that I use for this lesson, and thank you very much.